welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, welcome to Syosset Library's podcast. This is Jessica. I am your host, and I am here with the author of Dead of Winter, Sarah Clegg. This is a really good seasonal podcast episode, I think, because it talks about some of my favorite things, which are creepy, dark things, but it comes at a time when generally, I think the general public does not think about creepy, dark things. And traditionally, the Yuletide or Christmas time period was a lot creepier than we knew it. So why don't you tell us a little bit about this book and who you are and how you came to write it?
Sure. So I actually first came to this book when I was writing my first. My first book was about this group of child-snatching seductive demonesses who you can trace. I was tracing them from ancient Mesopotamia through folklore down to the present day. And while I was looking into them, I was researching child-snatching demons with iron body parts, which sounds like a super specific category, but is actually covers quite a wide range of monsters. And amongst all of them, I found Perkta, who is this monstrous witch with an iron nose, who goes house to house every Christmas, leading a cavalcade of the dead. And if she finds a child who hasn't done their chores, then she slits open their bellies, pulls out their guts, stuffs them full of straw, and then sews them back up again with a plowshare as a needle and a chain as thread. And when I first came across her, she is so joyously monstrous. And that connection with Christmas felt incredibly jarring when I was reading about her. And then the more I sat with it and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that Christmas is absolutely jam-packed with monsters. You know, I knew about Krampus. He's the one who I think most people are at least distantly aware of, kind of this towering goat monster with huge horns and horrible teeth who rampages through Germany and Austria every December the 5th and beats or kidnaps little children. There's also Grýla, who's an ogress in Iceland who comes down from the mountains and pops her victims into a giant stew and then eats them. I myself have a Christmas ritual that I've observed since I was very little, where I read a ghost story at Christmas, and normally a Victorian ghost story, of the kind that they don't tend to be set at Christmas necessarily, but they were written to be read aloud on Christmas. And obviously one of our most beloved Christmas stories, A Christmas Carol, is absolutely jam-packed with ghosts. It is a ghost story first and foremost, before it's a story about, you know, heartwarming family stuff and everyone turning out lovely in the end. It's full of hauntings. And Dickens wrote others as well that were significantly less heartwarming and had significantly more in the way of Christmas hauntings. And it just became this topic that I was so interested in. And I wanted to understand why this time that we, you know, typically associate with presents and merriment and feasting actually had all these associations with something so much darker, and also why we'd lost them. I mean, we haven't completely lost them, but why they've diminished to some extent. Yeah.
Well, first of all, you know, I think it's really interesting to say that, you know, when you think about this time of year, it is like the darkest time of year. And I suppose, you know, in a lot of pre-Christian traditions, it was also a time when people would kind of get together around a fire and, you know, things would seem sort of scary. Please tell me if I'm wrong.
I mean, broadly, what I would say is for pre-Christian traditions. So a lot of this stems from Saturnalia. We can kind of get into that.
Yeah, because you talk about that in the book.
But that's kind of this Roman tradition. And I think when we normally say kind of pagan pre-Christian, we might be thinking a little bit more North European. And the thing is, we don't have anything in the sources about the idea that this kind of Christmas spookiness comes from these sort of pagan cultures of Northern Europe. We don't have much on their solstice celebrations. We know that, you know, monuments were built like kind of Stonehenge, that the solstice, the sun at the solstice would appear in certain ways through them. So they're certainly there to kind of honor the solstice and celebrate it in some way. But where we do have any kind of record of pre-Christian North European solstice practices, they're cheery. They, you know, we eat some food, we have a celebration, we wear nice clothes. I mean, you can't take much at face value from quite a few of these accounts. You know, the Romans tended to make up nonsense about a lot of cultures and then write about it as if it was true. But one would think if there was something as juicy as darkness and the solstice, they would have really gone in for it. And no one mentions anything. It really is in kind of late antiquity and into the Middle Ages when this idea of Christmas as this really dark time full of monsters really develops and grows in really interesting and fascinating ways.
So you do talk about Saturnalia a bit in the book. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. So in ancient Rome, in late December, there is this festival called Saturnalia, and it's a time to turn the world on its head. Masters serve their slaves. Previously illegal activities like gambling are suddenly allowed. Everyone's wearing odd clothes. You get together as groups of friends and you elect a kind of king to lead you in your revels, and you have to obey any command this false king gives you, which are normally like horribly embarrassing. They're things like dance naked outside or yell insulting insults about yourself and things like this. Insulting insults. Yell false insults about yourself in public and things like that. It is a kind of quite an unsettling time as well. But it doesn't seem to be specifically tied to any kind of monstering. In late antiquity, kind of belief in the god Saturn starts to fade, Christianity starts to come and take its place, and eventually the end of December is the time when you celebrate Christmas. But the chaos of Saturnalia endured, and it especially slipped into this festival on January the 1st. It's called Calends. That was also an ancient Roman festival. It was an incredibly boring one. It was originally the time when consuls took office, and it's about as thrilling as that sounds. You're not meant to argue with people, and you wear nice clothes, and then there's a stately procession to the capital. But by late antiquity, as Saturnalia slips away, you can watch as most of the partying moves to Calends. And you have all these complaints from churchmen, which is most of our sources for a lot of these festivals for kind of the early Middle Ages. All of these churchmen complaining about the wild parties that their own sort of congregations are taking part in on Calends. They're furious that they're cross-dressing, which was an enormous thing at Calends, and still is, at least in England at Christmas. You get things like pantomime dames and stuff like that, where cross-dressing is still very important. There was still all this stuff about kind of turning the world on its head, and all of these previously sort of unheard of activities that you wouldn't be doing day to day, suddenly you're allowed to. At least socially, the churchmen feel you absolutely are not allowed to as far as they're concerned. And in all of this, something new is added. From the 4th century AD on, we see increasing complaints that Christian congregations at Calends, and then slowly kind of back into Christmas again, are dressing up as monsters in outfits that we're told are specifically made to look as terrifying as possible. And they are running house to house, bashing on the doors and demanding that they be giving money or food or alcohol. It sounds a lot like trick-or-treating, because functionally it is. This is kind of the origin of trick-or-treating. It continues as a practice all the way through. I mean, functionally down to the present day. You can still see people dressing up as monsters and going house to house, demanding treats even at Christmas, in some parts of Europe. But in the 16th century, it kind of hops over to Halloween. There was already kind of this door-to-door begging activity, ritualized begging activity associated with Halloween, where you would beg for soul cakes, which are these little kind of spiced currant cakes, and would offer to pray for the members of the household in return. So you would go around crying souls for a soul cake. And then in Ireland and Scotland, where there was also this idea that Halloween was connected to kind of an unsettling time of supernatural activity, from the 16th century, they start dressing up in the same way they were at Christmas as well. They call it guising, which is the same word that's used for it at Christmas. It's very clearly slipping back through the year. And then it spreads to America, and Canada gets the word trick or treat added and comes back to Europe in its kind of new Americanized form. But for most of history, if you ever found yourself dressed as a monster, running house to house, bashing on doors and demanding treats, you were more likely to be doing it at Christmas than you were to be doing it at Halloween.
So some of the other things I want to talk about, are like you have obviously, we still see videos of like Krampus festivals and things like that. But there are also you talk a bit of the horse heads.
Yeah.
Which is something again that I wouldn't have associated with this time of year, if you want to chat about that.
Sure, absolutely. So where to start? In Wales, in the modern day, then you can go to these celebrations called wassails. Sometimes they're in orchards and sometimes they're kind of this house-to-house visiting thing. But what's important is there is a monster there called the Mary Lwyd, and it is a horse skull on a pole held by a performer who's hiding under a sheet. And there's a piece of string attached to the jaw of the horse skull, so they can kind of clack it at you and make it lunge at you and bite at you. And the horse skull is also, it's kind of got baubles jammed into its eyes and bits of tinsel glued to it. And often there's a bauble kind of jammed between its teeth as well. They are really quite horrible things. They have this kind of very disconcerting appearance. That is not helped by the fact that they're constantly turning around and snapping at you. And you get very similar monsters. I mean, so you still get very similar monsters across the UK at Christmas. Normally, unlike in Wales, it's a wooden horse head rather than a skull. By rights, that should be less horrible than a skull. I would say on balance, it's about the same. They're normally made from sort of two planks of wood that clack against each other when the jaw's snapped. They have these horrible, mad, staring eyes. And often they have real teeth in their mouths, they're just grim. They are kind of playing with that fear very, very intentionally. And you can find monsters like these all across Europe as well. The main difference being that in England and Wales and just the UK in general, they tend to be horses. And in Europe, they tend to have horns and be thought of either as stags or goats, or in one case as a weird beaked horned monster. But you've got creatures like the Turon, the Collata, the Habergeis, that are all like this. And what's incredibly interesting is that it seems like they are related to the monster costumes that were first attested in the 4th century AD. They seem to go right back to the beginning of this tradition, because in the 4th century AD and late antiquity in general, the complaining churchmen do give us like little bits of information about the costumes. And we know especially that they were made using stags' heads, very specifically heads rather than masks, and very specifically stags. Sometimes it's a cow. But it does seem to have that kind of similarity. And we even have sort of, a little bit later, but we have a representation from a few centuries later in a Flemish manuscript of a man who is dressed exactly like a Mary Lwyd or any one of these kind of modern Christmas monsters, holding the head on a pole, hiding under a sheet with the little thing that means that he can clack the jaw at people. It looks identical to any Mary Lwyd you've seen, except it's got the stag horns. So it does seem like there is this continuous line of transmission between the kind of modern monsters and the monsters of late antiquity, which is kind of incredible.
So what was one of your favorite parts about researching for this book?
Well, I mean, so one of the big things I did, I didn't just want to kind of read about these things because they're still practiced today. I mean, obviously in different forms, they're not exactly the same thing that was practiced hundreds of years ago. They constantly change, but you can still go to a Krampus run today. You can still meet a Mary Lwyd. You can go to a wassail. You can see a mummers play. These things are all still there and all still happening. So I spent a Christmas kind of going to all of these kind of celebrations. And it was absolutely fantastic. I would say the Krampus run was my absolute favorite. I think because I'd sort of seen footage of it. Kind of all these people in these terrifying, monstrous costumes rampaging through the streets. And I thought it must be a bit more health and safety conscious than it looks on a YouTube video. I'm sure whoever's made this is just trying to make it look wild and chaotic, but it's not actually. And then I went there and oh my God, they all have switches like bundles of sticks or grass, and they will really hit you with them. They grab your hair, they pull you and push you around. They're running rampant through the streets. I actually ended up with kind of welts and bruises all over the backs of my legs from where one of them hit me especially hard. It was like nothing I have ever experienced, and actually seems quite close to some of the discussions that we have about these early traditions, where the history of them tends to be told through people desperately trying to ban them and saying people are getting hurt, people are killed at some time. I mean, not at the current Krampus runs, but people used to be killed when they engaged in these kind of dark Christmas mayhem activities. People were often injured. We have plenty of complaints about it. So to be able to go to one that did feel a bit, this doesn't entirely feel safe, did kind of have that resonance with the activities that I've been seeing before. I mean, I went to a Mary Lwyd wassail as well, and it was incredible. But I would say that, I was standing next to the horrible horse monster to take a photo, and the horrible horse monster was like, "Oh, did you come far today?" She's like, I'm not getting like the age-old terror of Christmas here. But I very much did at the Krampus run.
That is wild. That is absolutely wild. Wow. So yeah, this again is like a really cool book because it's equal parts informative, it's spooky, it's a little bit of like your own travel log, which I found really cool. Yeah. So what did this lead you to your next book? Because you did mention that your last book led you to this one.
Actually, it did. So there was something that I thought about including and then decided that I didn't quite work for this book and led me to the next book, which is in Iceland. There is this idea, as well as all of this spookiness, that Christmas is a time when elves and fairies are abroad. And there is especially this tradition in Iceland where on 12th night, it's meant to be the night that elves are traveling. And people light fires on beaches. And I would say it's about 50-50 with the folklore. Some people and some sources say that the fires are to guide the elves on their way. And some of them say that the fires are to keep the elves out. and drive them back. And it has this really fascinating kind of tension between these monsters, not these monsters, but these creatures are kind of equal parts wonderful and beautiful and also horrifying. And they're both things that you want in your life and things you don't want in your life. So my next book is actually looking at the history of fairies and the history of the folklore of fairies to understand how we've kind of come down to the place where we are today, where they're both kind of pretty girly creatures with covered in sparkles and also horrible things and also kind of sexually aggressive, but in a way people are broadly pro creatures, which I would have to say people in the Middle Ages would have been reading the crop of current fairy smut and being like, yes, I recognize this seems very familiar. So yeah, that's my next one.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing. This was a really, like I said, like this was a really cool book. I think like one of my favorite things also was you talk a little bit about like original depictions of Saint Nicholas, which I loved reading about. I don't know if you want to leave us with that.
I mean, so originally Saint Nicholas he's quite a mean saint. One of the things he's renowned for is punching someone, sort of punching a fellow churchman. He was, so, he is the person who started the Arian heresy, which is terrible and shocking. But no one else was punching anyone at that council. It was just Santa. And there's also all these stories of like, he helps this woman whose son is misbehaving to drive the demon out of him. And then there are other stories where he is, maybe kindly is the wrong word, but he is the hero. So there's one tale where there's 3 boys who are kidnapped and murdered by this butcher who then tries to pickle them. And a passing St. Nicholas stops him and resurrects the boys. And after that, according to the legend, the butcher is forced to follow St. Nicholas for all eternity, whipping the children who don't deserve Santa's presents. St. Nicholas will also quiz you quite often. One of the things sort of people used to dress as him, that's quite an early thing, people dressing up as Santa, but he used to go round to little boys and girls and quiz them on their schooling, on the Bible, and if you got it wrong, quite often there'd be a monster lurking behind him ready to punish. The thing that I really love as well is that obviously, so you've got kind of these people Christmas trick-or-treating in horrible disguises. And sometimes St. Nicholas is accompanying them. Sometimes as well, gangs of St. Nicholases are going house to house. And sometimes they behave just as badly as the people dressed as monsters. So we have accounts of like drunken gangs of St. Nicholases getting into trouble and the authorities being furious with them, which I just love the idea of drunk Santas roaming the streets causing problems.
I mean, have you ever seen or heard of SantaCon?
This is very true, actually. Yeah, bringing it back.
Because let me tell you, if you like that type of thing, you can absolutely travel to the States and you can certainly see that in a very interesting context.
The next Christmas travel log will have to involve SantaCon.
Oh, 100%. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. This was lovely. This was a really great book. Very well researched, very cool. Dead of Winter. When is it officially out?
Oh, it's out already.
It's out already. Okay.
Early this month, yeah.
Yes. So pick it up as a stocking stuffer with some coal, maybe. Or just some nice bright things as well. And read a little bit about it because it's really interesting and it's really just very cool. I learned a lot of things myself. And yeah, now we know maybe there's the historical roots of SantaCon. Thank you so much. Can't wait for your next book.
so much for having me on.
This was Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast. My guest was Sarah Clegg, and we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.